Hello everybody. First I'd like to apologize for the long in between videos. I know it's been a while since my last upload. I've had a lot of stuff going on, but with the new year, I decided to make this more of a priority in my life. And so yeah, we're going to be on page 132 of The Great War for Civilization, chapter The Carpet Weavers. I'm going to be starting a little bit further back than where I may have left off in the last video, just to try to catch myself up as well. But here we go. It would be 7 months before I saw Kalkali again. His monstrous reputation had not been sullied by a temporary fall in the number of executions. By July of 1980, his wrath was falling on new and more fruitful pastures. He stood now, this formidable judicial luminary, in the sunny courtyard of Kaiser Prison, brandishing a miniature pink plastic spoon, smacking his lips noisily and tucking into a large cardboard tub of vanilla ice cream. For a man who had just ordered the first public execution in Tehran for 15 years, he was in an excellent frame of mind. 5 days earlier, a gruesome new precedent had been set when 4 people, 2 of them middle-aged married women, were stoned to death in the southern Iranian city of Kerman. All had been condemned for sexual offenses by one of Kalkali's revolutionary courts, and within hours the condemned had been dressed in white cloth, buried up to their chests in the ground, and bombarded with rocks as large as a man's fist. In a characteristic and typically unnecessary comment, the court later stated that all 4 had died of brain damage. The women were condemned for being involved in prostitution and for deceiving young girls. One of the men was convicted of homosexuality and adultery, and the other for allegedly raping a 10-year-old girl. Before execution, the 4 were ritually bathed and shrouded, a ceremonial white hood being placed over their heads. Local clergymen had visited the condemned and chosen the stones for the execution, varying in size between 1 and 6 inches in diameter. It took the 2 women and 2 men 15 minutes to die. And there's a cross there that goes to the bottom of the page that states, "This was believed to be the first time in living memory that Muslims had been stoned to death in the Middle East after a court hearing. Stoning was a common village punishment in Iran and other Islamic countries for hundreds of years, and in the 19th century members of the minority Baha'i sect were killed with stones in Shiraz and Tehran, but they died at the hands of mobs, not after a judicial trial. Prostitutes were stoned to death long before the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and the Bible describes how Jesus Christ tried to stop the practice." Sorry, there's a problem with my headset at the moment. Back to... "I don't know if I approve of stoning," Sadiq Kakali said, flashing a grin at us journalists and at a group of startled diplomats who had also been invited to the Kaiser prison. Quote, "But in the Quran, it is mentioned that those who commit adultery should be killed by stoning," end quote. Sorry, there are some quotes that I haven't been calling out. The Hojatul Islam dug his little spoon into the melting white ice cream, oblivious to the bare-headed prisoners who trudged past behind him, heaving barrels loaded with cauldrons of vegetable soup. Quote, "We approve of anything the Quran says. What is the difference between killing people with stones and killing them with bullets? But throwing stones certainly teaches people a lesson," end quote. Kalkali modestly disowned responsibility for the Kerman stonings. His bearded public relations man informed us that a man called Fahim Kermani had taken his weighty decision, but he agreed that he had ordered some fresh executions that morning. 7 men had been lined up at one end of Jamshid Street at 5 o'clock and shot down by a firing squad, while a large crowd gawked from a distance. Many of those who died had been convicted of drug offenses, and it was in his role as chief of the Iranian anti-narcotics squad that that the Hojato Islam had welcomed us to Kaiser prison to view his latest haul of contraband. One could only be impressed. Kalkali had piled it up in the prison mosque, a magnificent frescoed edifice with a cupola of red and blue tiles, now filled with tons of opium, kilogram sacks of heroin, large sticky slabs of hashish, stolen refrigerators, ornately carved backgammon boards, a 2.5-meter wall of cigarettes. Here I thought briefly of Harvey Morris in his Router's, quote, Saturnalia, end quote. Thousands of bubble pipes, carpets, knives, automatic rifles, and rows of champagne bottles, in parentheses, Krug, 1972, and end parentheses. The beautiful mosque literally reeked of hashish as Kalkali made a triumphal tour of his loot, pushing his way past 20 tons of opium and at least 100 kilograms of heroin, each neatly packed into clean white sacks. It was inevitable that he would be asked whether the revolutionary courts were dealing enthusiastically enough with drug dealers, and equally inevitable that the Hojato Islam would evince a broad smile, directed at the diplomats, before replying, quote, "If we did what others wanted us to do, we would have to kill many people, which in my opinion is simply impossible," end quote, he said. Quote, "Things could end up in a crisis. If we were going to kill everyone who had 5 grams of heroin, we would have to kill 5,000 people, and that would be difficult," end quote. In fairness, it should be added that the Ayatollah had made a fair start. In the past 7 weeks, his courts had summarily dispatched 176 men and women to the firing squads for narcotics offenses, many of them sentenced by Kalkali himself in the innocuous tree-shaded concrete building 300 meters from the little mosque. Kalkali tried hard not to look like an ogre. He repeatedly denied that he was any such thing. His small, plump frame, gray beard, and twinkling eyes give him a fatherly appearance, the kind of man who might have been more at home at the fireside in carpet slippers, with the family cat purring beside him, just so long as the family cat survived. He joked frequently with us as he made his rounds at the mosque, good-naturedly poking his finger into the sacks of opium that lay beneath the main cupola. Every minute or so, a young man in a pale green shirt, with a pistol tucked into his trousers, would clamber onto a pile of heroin bags and scream, "God is great," at the top of his lungs, a refrain that would be taken up and echoed around the mosque. Quote, "If you look at me, you don't see an inner struggle written all over my face," end quote, Kalkali remarked as he emerged into the sunshine. Quote, "But I am actually a revolutionary person. I am chasing agents everywhere, in France, England, and America. That is a fact. I am chasing them everywhere," end quote. He claimed a 200% success in stamping out drug running in Iran and an 80% victory in preventing international drug trafficking, which was why the diplomats had been invited to the Kaiser prison to listen to the judge. He claimed that an intercontinental mafia was operating a drug ring from Pakistan, Burma, and Thailand, and described how a member of the ex-Shah's family allegedly used a private aircraft to fly drugs from Afghanistan to a small airfield outside Tehran. The captured opium, he said, might be used by the government for medical purposes. The hashish and heroin would be burned. The Hojatul Islam strode briskly from the courtyard towards the wire fence, but as he did so, something very strange happened. Dozens of black-veiled women, the wives and sisters of the very men whom the Ayatollah would soon be sentencing, ran across a lawn towards him, clutching babies and crying, "Hail, hail to Kalkali." The Hojatul Islam affected not to notice them as the soldiers held them at bay, and he pushed his way through a gate in the fence. For a few moments he talked of holding a formal press conference before entering his tiny courthouse, but then a policeman walked over to us and told us that the judge had become angry. Sensing that a Hojatul Islam's fury could embrace a journalist or two, we've brought this most extraordinary public event to a hurried conclusion. We fled. And there's an asterisk there that goes to I was taping Kalkali's prison tour for CBC radio, and on the cassette in my archives it is still possible to hear the Hojato Islam's lips smacking over his ice cream as he discusses the finer points of stoning. And not the good kind of stoning. Back up we go. For Westerners, Kalkali represented a special danger. If the American hostages in the embassy were to be tried by an Islamic court, what if Kalkali was let loose on them? All Khomeini's promises of protection could be reinterpreted now that the embassy documents were being slowly put back together to reveal that the Iranian claims of a spy nest in Tehran were not entirely without foundation. Thus, when the Shah moved from the United States to Panama, a journey of which the Iranians were forewarned by 3 Western diplomats acting at Washington's request, the, quote, students of the Imam, end quote, put out a statement repeating the promise to try the Americans. And there's a cross there that goes to the full flavor of the somewhat portentous statements released in English by the Pars News Agency on 16th of December is best conveyed in the following extract. Quote, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, and the Islamic nation of Iran, the great Satan, or the great Satan, the United States, this origin of corruption of West, after being defeated by our great nation, is trying to give asylum to its corrupt servant, the runaway Shah, and to prevent justice being implemented. In order to free itself from its great political deadlock and befool its nation, the U.S. has embarked on a futile effort and has sent the criminal Mohammad Reza out of the U.S. and has delivered to his puppet Panama. We hereby announce that to reveal the treacherous plots by the criminal U.S. and to punish it, the spy hostages will be tried. End quote. Ooh. For Westerners, Kalkali represented a where did I go? Oh, there it is. In the end, of course, there was no trial. Inevitably, the Iranians lost their patience with the foreign journalists in Tehran. The day after the trial statement, Abul Hassan Sadiq walked into the Iranian Ministry of Islamic Guidance with the troubled expression of a headmaster forced at last to deal with a persistently unruly class. Harvey Morris, shrouded in his usual smoke haze, mercifully for him, it was to be at least a decade before Iran would ban smoking in government buildings, knew what was coming. Quote, well, Fisky, we'll see who's going to get the order of the boot today, end quote, he murmured. The ministry contained an underground auditorium that looked uncomfortably like a school hall, and there we waited to hear the worst. Sadiq, the school director, took his place at a desk on a small raised podium and stared down at us severely. We all knew that an expulsion or two was in the air. Gentlemen, he began. Harvey always looked like the gentleman bit. Quote, I want to share with you a bit of agony we are going through with regard to the foreign media. With great displeasure, we are expelling the entire Time magazine crew from Iran. End quote. It mattered little that the entire staff of Time in the country numbered just 2. This was not how Sadiq saw things. There were over 300 foreign journalists in Iran from more than 30 countries, he said, but Time had gone too far. He flourished a clutch of front covers from the offending organ, one of which carried an unflattering portrait of Khomeini. Quote, since the problem of hostages came up, end quote, Sadiq said, waving the latest issue of Time in his hand, quote, this has done nothing but arouse the hatred of the American people. The front covers have been like a hammer on the brain. The magazine has created some very irrational reaction on behalf of the American people, end quote. Time was not the only news organization to feel Iranian wrath. 8 days earlier, Alex, I'm sorry for butchering this, F. Thivolos, A correspondent for the Associated Press, a bearded part Russian Cypriot, Cypriot, who looked like Rasputin, had been expelled for allegedly distorting news of rioting in the Azerbaijani provincial capital of Tabriz. Even the British had fallen foul of Iranian anger. In early December, Anayat Etihad of Iranian television had been watching BBC News in a London hotel and was angered by a report on the hostages in which Keith Graves described in unpleasant detail how their hands were bound with rope and how they were forbidden to speak to each other or receive news from the outside world. I wasn't surprised. Over the next 2.5 decades, Graves would infuriate the Taliban, the Israel Army, the U.S. government, the U.S. government, the IRA, the British Army, NATO, the Egyptians, the PLO, and the Hezbollah, the Syrians, the Turks, and even the Cypriots. The latter an astonishing achievement even for a man of Graves's abrasiveness, and survived them all. But the BBC was made to pay for it. Etihad instructed Iranian television to refuse BBC crews any further use of satellite facilities. The BBC was forced to ship all their film unprocessed by air to London, where it usually arrived a day late. It was clear, however, that Etihad was far more upset by the BBC's Persian-language radio service, and Sadiq brandished a sheaf of papers above his head, complaints, he said, about the Persian service from all over Iran. Sadiq was confident about his broadsides. He loudly referred to the fact that one of the two Time correspondents had once worked for the CIA. Quote, "Yet still I let him into Iran." End quote. He was referring to Bruce von Vorst, who worked as a CIA research officer in the late 1950s, but who now said that he had severed all links with the agency, whose own activities in the country were now, thanks to the embassy documents, a national Iranian obsession. The American CBS network was in trouble for comparing the students in the embassy to the German Baader Meinhof gang. The ABC network for a State Department analysis, quote, "that would make any Iranian look like an idiot," end quote. But there was a pettiness about the government's response to overseas coverage, a gut reaction that sprang from patriotic anger rather than forethought. Sadiq, who in argument was given to drawing unhappy parallels with events in American history, unconsciously revealed this when he reminded us that in 1834 Colonel Travis defended the Alamo against the Mexican army, and when he was told to surrender, he replied with gunfire. He stood up for his principles, and that is what Iran is doing today. End quote. I heard Harvey Morris sigh. "Good God," he exclaimed. Quote, "I thought Travis lost the battle of the bloody Alamo." End quote. The revolution was a tempest, and we were all trapped in its vortex. We interviewed Khomeini, we watched the epic demonstrations, we watched America writhing in impotence. U.S. warships entered the Gulf. Khomeini called for an army of tens of thousands of schoolboy volunteers to defend Iran. I traveled back from Iranian Kurdistan on a bus whose passengers spent an hour watching a weapons education program on the coach's specially installed television. How to strip and reassemble an automatic rifle, how to pull a grenade pin, how to master the mechanism of a heavy machine gun. I swayed at the back of the fast-moving bus as the audience sat in silent attention. And today, I thought, we have naming of parts. But I was seeking some other way of reporting Iran, away from the events which were so obstinately staged for our benefit, especially for American television reporters. I was in Harvey's office, staring at the stained map of Iran on his wall, when I had an idea. What if I closed my eyes and stuck a pin into the map, and then traveled to the point I had marked and asked the people there about the revolution? Quote, "Close your eyes and I'll give you a pin," end quote, Harvey announced. Quote, And I bet you stick it in bloody Afghanistan," end quote. He produced the pin. I closed my eyes, stabbed at the map, and then opened my eyes again. The little sliver of silver had landed in the H of a village called Kahak, southwest of the city of Qazvin. I set off at dawn next morning. Kahak was the sort of place no one ever goes to visit. It lay, a rectangle of mud and clay single-story houses, at the end of a dirt road with only a gaggle of children and a dung heap picked over by fat chickens to welcome a stranger. Though the dust and the heat haze to the north, the Alborz Mountains ran along the horizon, forming the lower lip of the Caspian Sea basin. Foreigners never saw Kahak, except perhaps the passengers on the night train to the Soviet frontier, as it skirted the village orchards. Even then, it was doubtful if they would notice anything. Kahak was so small that its 950 inhabitants could not even support a mosque of their own. A prematurely aging man of 64, with a slick of perspiration running down his face from beneath his turban, and a shirt front covered in dirt, had to travel up from Qom to minister to the faithful. But he was a man capable of extraordinary energy, as he walked nimbly around the heaps of manure and puddles of gilded, fetid water, talking about the village in a possessive, slightly rhetorical, almost sermonizing way, his voice rising and falling in the cadences of a formal speech rather than a conversation. What had the revolution done for these people? I asked, and Sheikh Ibrahim Zad pointed to the hard, unwatered land beyond the mud huts, a desert of gray, unyielding earth. Quote, "The villagers own everything on both sides of the road," he said, "but they do not know how much land they have." End quote. The heat shimmered and danced on the dried-up irrigation ditches. There were no deeds of ownership, no papers, and no legal covenants in Kahak, now that the landlords had gone. Just when the landlords did depart was something that bothered Sheikh Zad. Quote, "In the past regime," he explained, "there were two big landowners, Habib Sardai and Ibrahim Solehi. The villagers lived in very bad conditions. Some of them were so poor that they owed many debts, but Sardai and Solehi came here and took their grain in payment. I remember seeing these villagers going to other villages to buy back their own grain at high prices. So the people had to borrow money for this, and they pay interest on the loans." End quote. More than a dozen villagers gathered around us as Sheikh Zad talked on. They were poor people, most of them Turkish in origin, with high, shiny cheekbones. Their gray jackets were torn, and their trousers frayed where the rubble and thorns in the fields had scratched them. They wore cheap plastic sandals. There was only one girl with them, a 13-year-old with dark hair, who had wrapped herself shroud-like in a pink and gray chador. Quote, "Then things improved for us," Sheikh Zad said. "Sardai and Solehi left with the land reforms." End quote. There was no perceptible change in the mullah's face. He had been asked about that year's Islamic revolution, but he was talking about the Shah's, quote, "white revolution," end quote, 17 years earlier, when the monarch's reform laws ostensibly curtailed the power of the big landowners. Private holdings were redistributed, and landowners could retain only one village. Poor farmers were thereby brought into the economy, although most laborers and farm workers remained untouched. Kahak, it was clear, did not entirely benefit from the Shah's, quote, "revolution," end quote. Quote, "There were good things for us in the reforms," Sheikh Zad said. The number of sheep owned by the villagers went up from 2,000 to 3,000, but the village itself, instead of being owned by two men, was now run by the government agent, a man called Darood Jalani, a capitalist from Kazvin. He was a bad man, and he collected rent by demanding half of the villagers' crops." End quote. There was an old man with an unshaven chin and a cataract in his left eye, who now walked to the front of the villagers. From his grubby yellow shirt and broken shoes, I could not have imagined that Aziz Mahmoudi was the village headman and the largest farmer. He looked at the mullah for a moment and said very slowly, quote, "Darood Jalani is in Kazvin prison now," end quote. Mahmoudi walked across the village square, followed by a small throng of school children. He pointed to a crumbling fortified mud house with 2 stories, a sign of opulence amid such hardship. Quote, "This is where Solehi used to live," he said, gesturing to the broken windows. Now Jelani is gone too. He will not come back. End quote. There was no reason why Jelani would return, even if he was released from prison. For on the first day of the revolution the previous February, when the villagers saw the imperial army surrendering in Tehran on the screen of a small black and white television set, they walked down to the fields that Jelani still owned on each side of the railway line. There they planted their own barley as a symbol that the revolution had arrived in Kahak. Above the blackboard in the village's tiny clay-walled schoolhouse was a poster of Ayatollah Khomeini. It depicted the imam bending over the bars of a jail, while behind him thousands of Iranian prisoners wait patiently for their freedom. One after another, the boys in the 7th grade class stood up and recited their admiration for Khomeini. Jalal Mahmoudi was 12, but talked about corruption in the Shah's regime. Ali Mahmoudi, who at 14 was head of class, launched into a long speech about the Imam's kindness to children. Quote, I am very pleased with the Ayatollah because in the past regime I was not taught well. Now there are 3 extra classes and we can stay at school longer. End quote. Master Ali might be expected to receive a firm clout round the back. Master Ali might be expected to receive a firm clout round the back of the head from his colleagues for such schoolboy enthusiasm. But the other children remained silent until asked to speak, and I knew that if I had visited this same village in the aftermath of the 1953 coup against Mossadegh, in which Monty Woodhouse had played so prominent a part, I would have heard the fathers of these same children talking about the corruption of Mossadegh and the Shah's kindness to children. Karim Kalaj was a teacher in his late 40s, and he said little as we sat in the staff room. He poured cups of tea from a large silver urn and sweetened it by drinking the tea sip by sip and nibbling lumps of sugar at the same time. Outside he walked across the dusty fields towards the railway line. He was briefly imprisoned in the Shah's time. He was fired from his job for complaining about a government teacher's bribery. The wind was picking up, and the trees in the orchard were moving. A far belt of smog moved down the horizon. Somewhere near Kahak, more than a quarter of a century earlier, Monty Woodhouse must have buried his guns. Did any of the villagers support the Shah? I asked Kalaj. Quote, none, he said firmly. At least I never knew any who did. End quote. Savak never came to the village. It was too small to capture anyone's attention. So whose picture hung above the blackboard in Class 7 before the Ayatollah returned to Iran? Mr. Kalaj shrugged. Quote, they had to put a picture there. Of course it was the Shah's. End quote. And that's the end of that chapter. The next chapter is going to be chapter 5, The Path to War. But I'm going to end it there for now and start that soon. Hopefully tomorrow. I'm not really sure how often I'm going to be doing this, but I'm hoping to do it more often, at least. Thank you so much. I hope everyone is having a happy new year, and good night.